Hi, if you're interested in Oriental rugs and other textiles and the cultures that made them past and present, RugTube is the place for you. We welcome collectors, dealers, aficionados, and maybe even scholars to talk about what's new, what's old, ideas, theories, and maybe even a bit of speculation here and there. We at RugTube know real art is the kind you can walk on.
This afternoon, I would like to say a few things about Chinese rugs, particularly why dealers and some collectors of the last generation did not appreciate Chinese rugs. This is a good example of the kind of rug that was available in European and American markets in the 1920s and 1930s. Clearly, it's made for a foreign market. The colors are very, very different. The designs are very distinctive from what a Chinese audience would think would be acceptable. The kind of rugs that were made for a Chinese market are behind me. There is a chair cover right behind me, and on the wall behind me, there is a good example of what is perhaps a mid-19th century Chinese rug. A lot of dating these rugs has to do with the kind of foundations they have, if they're machine spun or not. The rug on the wall behind me has a hand spun foundation, whereas the chair cover right behind me has a machine spun foundation, as does this example. Perhaps the best book for the types of Chinese rugs and where they were woven is Lorentz. He spent a long period of time in China. He understood the rugs very well, and he studied many examples of early Chinese rugs in Western collections. But before going deeply into the types of Chinese rugs, it's important to consider how they were valued, how they were appreciated by people in the West. Perhaps I can start with a book published in 1922 by Tattershall. In London. And here in Handwoven Carpets of Eastern Asia, Tattershall says, "The history of Chinese carpets has not yet been written, and the task cannot be undertaken with any approach to finality just yet. There is still need for careful research on the spot and for more representative collections to be formed in Europe so as to provide the field for comparative study. A few Chinese carpets, picked up by travelers, were brought to the West during the course of the last century. More recently still, the vogue which arose for Chinese art generally focused attention on the carpets, and large numbers were shipped to America and Europe by commercial agents. For the most part, it was as novelties as they gained their popularity." In other words, they weren't appreciated for their artistic merit like a Persian rug, but they were appreciated as novelties. Now, this again is writing in the 20s. Perhaps a generation later, it seems from the evidence on the ground, markets in Europe and America were saturated with Chinese rugs. However, these were very clearly designed for a Western market, and perhaps they were even made with that from the very beginning. In 1911, Lewis G. Griffin Lewis writes in his practical book of Oriental rugs about Chinese rugs. Chinese rug weaving is of obscure origin, but there is every indication that the art was practiced in China more than 12 centuries ago. The Chinese rug, however, is the last of all the products of the Eastern loom to be introduced into America. In fact, its existence was almost unknown to the Western world until the close of the last century. During the Boxer Rebellion, some pieces were exported to this country, and since the World War, the exportation has rapidly increased. 20 or 30 years ago, many antique pieces from temples and palaces came to Europe and America, for which fabulous prices were realized. A few wise connoisseurs, in the meantime, securing all the choice pieces available, and some have made themselves independently wealthy by their sagacious forethought. Well, this passage says something about the market, in that in the 20s and 30s, the market was flooded with Chinese rugs, whereas an earlier generation before that, they were exceedingly rare. This suggests that Chinese production really got cracking later on in the 20th century, whereas very early in the 20th century, it perhaps wasn't such a commercial product. And of course, in the 19th century, hardly any examples were in American and European collections at that time. The book Chinese Rugs stands as an exception to the rule because it deals with Chinese rugs specifically in a volume. Many volumes in the early 20th century did not discuss Chinese rugs at all. Leach says, in compiling this work, the author is urged by a lack of a volume which deals adequately with the subject of the Chinese rug. Having learned from experience that no volume on the general subject of Oriental rugs satisfactorily with the Chinese member, if indeed this is mentioned at all, and that the few existing treatises on the latter subject are concerned with a single phase of the industry, or else yield a superficial consideration of the general topic. The final book I will consider is published in 1937, Rosabelle Holt, the book on Oriental and Occidental rugs. Again, this shows some progression in the understanding of Chinese rugs, and definitely a progression in the market. In the chapter dealing with Chinese rugs, I start, the Chinese rugs of antiquity are remarkable and worthy of the closest inspection. Their texture, designs, and symbolism show the greatest patience and thought. Antique wool rugs woven in China are very scarce, and because of this, and for their historical interest, as well as their uniqueness and attractiveness, they bring large prices. In fact, they are almost unprocurable. A large and very fine specimen of this kind of rug is in the home of the late Governor Ames of Boston. It measures 19 by 21 feet. The colors are yellow and white, and these are arranged in odd designs over the entire rug. A member of the family owning it writes, this rug is said to have originally been in the emperor's palace in China. As every emperor is obligated to have the palace newly furnished when he succeeds the throne, owing to some superstition connected with the retaining of any of the former emperor's possessions, everything is removed and destroyed. Fortunately, this rug escaped destruction. It's very clear that many rugs dating to the early 20th century follow very ancient patterns, but it's less clear what the earliest Chinese rugs should date. I discussed a little bit of that in an academic paper I wrote for the journal East and West. It's titled Carpets of the Ming Dynasty, and I will present a link below this lecture for enjoyment. I'd like to mention briefly about other weavings This is an example of a rug that has similar coloration to Chinese rugs, but it is made in Tibet. Tibet is an entirely separate entity from Chinese rugs in many ways. In design, they share some features, but in terms of their export to the West, they were exported even later than rugs from the main part of China. These will be dealt with in an entirely different lecture. But briefly, it's interesting to speculate why Chinese rugs never caught on. I think one of the main reasons is that it is so difficult to get early examples of Chinese rugs. In contrast, Near Eastern rugs were exported in great quantities to Europe and America in the 19th century. There are many good 19th century examples of Near Eastern rugs, Persian rugs, Anatolian rugs, all over. A variety of conditions are also available. The same is not true of Chinese rugs. 19th century and earlier Chinese rugs are very scarce, and this could be why traditional rug dealers never really warmed up to Chinese rugs. Even now, many early Chinese rugs are presented by dealers who specialize in East Asian art, and they're relatively left alone by dealers who specialize in, say, Persian rugs. This does not necessarily mean that they are an inferior product. Of course, as objects of art, it requires a considerable amount of background to understand what the weaver was trying to portray. And particularly since many areas of the Near East are now off limits for research, Chinese rugs seem like another good example of rugs that should be studied and appreciated, particularly because you can visit their land of their origin very easily. Thank you very much for your time.